Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. I must say, I feel very, very lucky to be here. I feel very privileged to be here. So I'll give you that bit more about the Brunelleschi thing that you just heard earlier. The truth about that one. Yeah, attracted to Italy by Brunelleschi, but in my attempts to learn Italian language while I was out there, I put an advert in a bookshop window looking for a conversation partner, and my wife telephoned me. Not my real wife then, you know, my wife-to-be, okay? My only wife, by the way. So I got married. I went out to Italy to study. I found love instead, and I ended up teaching in Italy at various institutions, and was in the right place at the right time to do something very, very special. A landmark in my life, which was to help the University of New Haven set up its own satellite campus in Tuscany, in the city of Prato, where I lived. Later on, that became a doubly exciting thing because of the involvement with LYME Academy. So I'm thrilled to be at the receiving end of 8 LYME students out there for the first semester in Italy, the first LYME students we've had out there, I mean. And this, I'm sure, with the help of all the people here as well, is something which is it's a beginning of a long journey, I think, and great connectivity between LYME students and Europe as a place of study. So that's very, very exciting. And I'm always very excited to come to LYME Academy. I think people always tell me that Italy must be beautiful. I think LYME is a beautiful place, and I keep meeting great people here every time I come. And I got so excited today, I even bought a painting. So that was in the planning for a long time. So I'm going to talk to you. I mean, what's going on when a British person wants to talk to you about gesture? You know, that doesn't really sound right, does it? We associate southern Mediterranean, southern Europe, you know, with gesture, gesticulation. We have all sorts of words for it. You know, we talk about people waving their arms around. You know, you've heard all the stereotypical things like, you know, it looked as though those two people were arguing, maybe they're actually friends, those kinds of things. And perhaps in Northern Europe and maybe in other parts of the Anglo-Saxon world, there's perhaps a little embarrassment about the potential excess of gesture. But I'm not here really to talk about that kind of gesture, although it does play a part. And always bear in mind, we're talking about, you know, I teach art history courses to LYME and West Haven campus students in Italy all the time. And we're looking at paintings and sculptures a lot, and we're trying to interpret the meaning, or find ways of finding out how we can apply perhaps, you know, modern ideas and modern reactions to paintings. But at times that's not enough. Just as our students are trying to learn a foreign language when they get out there, they're also finding themselves sometimes a little frustrated when they don't understand the non-verbal languages in Italy. That happens every time they walk into a cafe or have a conversation with one of their conversation partners in Prato. We could extend the same kinds of difficulties to the visual arts as well, because what's to say that the gestures in a painting are gestures that are familiar in my culture, and what's to say that those gestures aren't extinct, given that the paintings we're looking at are sometimes 500 years old. So that's fundamentally the topic today. We've got a great contrast here between a modern Italian gesture that does not exist in the English language, as far as I know, and on the right an excerpt from a famous painting by Leonardo DaVinci, one of the Madonnas of the Rocks. Okay, I'm going to begin, as many art history lectures seem to do, with a great Italian painter called Giotto. Giotto was a Tuscan painter, painting around 1300, as I'm sure everybody here knows. And I begin with this one because even though we're going to talk largely about 15th and 16th century gesture, I think we have to start with Giotto, because it looks as though Giotto didn't need any lessons from anybody about the power of gesture in painting. Take his Lamentation fresco from the Arena Chapel in Padua, for example. This guy today could be a film director, he could be a director on stage, everything placed so perfectly to accentuate the central action, which is, of course, the encounter between a mother and her dead son. Grouped around the corpse of Christ, leaving a little gap so that you can imagine yourself sitting right there, joining those hooded women facing the body. Look at the range of gestures here as well. A range of body language and gesture which seems quite clearly orchestrated to focus on one simple relationship. Look at the range of gestures too. Compare, for example, the very stoic-looking male figures at the far right, who seem to be very restrained, stoic about the whole thing. And then if we zoom in on the relationship between the figure of Christ and the Virgin Mary, we have probably one of the most extraordinary close-ups in the history of Italian art. Christ's face just as distorted as his mother's. And if we take a closer look, I think this is quite interesting. It almost looks as though the Virgin Mary is feeling for a pulse on Christ's neck. Not sure if that could be the fact, or it could be the case or not, but that's quite interesting close-up. Anyway, extraordinary contrast between that figure and those two figures down at the far end. So there's variety, there's drama, there are extremes, and there's characterization. Now, let's run through to the beginning of the 15th century and the contribution to our study here of the great Italian writer, architect, theorist, painter, sculptor, Leon Battista Alberti, who published in the first half of the 15th century probably one of the most influential texts of the Quattrocento, della pittura, or just on painting, in which he introduced a new idea, the so-called historia, which, like many Italian gestures, cannot be translated. There is no suitable English word for this new idea. Historia, said Alberti, is a narrative painting with a complex composition and a large number of figures. Great. But how does an historia have to be effective? He went on, and it's worth looking at because this book was devoured by everybody in the 15th century, patrons and artists alike, and formed the first theoretical foundation for what we might call good art. By the way, just stop for a second, open parentheses. Alberti defined good art in this treatise on painting. There's some extraordinary new things he's trying to do in this treatise. Anyway, back to his definition of historia. How do we get a good historia? A checklist, if you like. I'm simplifying brutally, but Alberti writes to his patron. He wrote this in Latin first to patrons, and then wrote an Italian version, which was clearly addressed to less educated artist types. And he said the painter must be capable of employing perspective. I think we had quite clearly the 15th century, Alberti's time, sees an explosion of new interest in and mastery of optics, creating what we might call a realism that hadn't been seen in previous centuries. That perspective skill is not just for wow effect, it's to create unity, visual, temporal, and spatial. Because if you can't believe in the space, you're not going to believe in the people in it. Secondly, the artist needs to be able to paint with light and shade to obtain modelling. What other theorists at the time often called rilievo, or relief. 3D. Effective use of colour. You notice Alberti spelled things in the British way. No, that's a joke. That was me. I wrote that. And he must also master the use of gesture. And this is our segue into the next component. He must master the use of gesture. What did Alberti mean by gesture? Well, we'll quote him in translation directly. A good historia, or good art, a good narrative painting, moves the viewer's soul. This is basically what he's saying. If it doesn't move your soul, it's not good art, it's not good historia. The only way that's going to happen is when people painted in the composition show the movements of their souls, because we will weep with the weeping, laugh with the laughing, and grieve with the grieving. He also, apologies for a longer slide, but you can read that as we go ahead. He also recommended the use of a so-called commentator in paintings. And this could apply also to sculpture, of course, but we'll be doing a lot of paintings today. I like to see somebody who points things out to the viewer. This is something brand new in Renaissance art as well. In the Middle Ages, it's very difficult to find somebody in an artwork that acknowledges your presence as the viewer, or looks at you, or points at you, or invites you to consider a certain part of the composition. So this is new, and Alberti says that's our commentator. He doesn't use the word commentator. I do. And he's saying there's somebody, maybe it's somebody warning you off, maybe it's somebody indicating something incredible, maybe they're inviting you to weep or to laugh together with them, so they're alive and they acknowledge your existence as a viewer. So there's a new relationship here implied between the viewer and the artwork, which we generally haven't seen before. Okay, let's have a look. What's going on in Florence around the same time? Well, we must, this is a very famous fresco by Masaccio, the Florentine painter. We took our LYME students to see this about a week ago. So we were standing in front of this in the church of Santa Maria Novella in the centre of Florence. And I'm sure they were thrilled to see this landmark of Western art. Always pops up in history books as the first great demonstration of the use of single-point linear perspective in Western art, perhaps since antiquity. Masaccio was very close friend to Brunelleschi. There's certainly a lot of change and action going on in the fields of optics in Florence at this time. But we must concede that Masaccio was already dead before Alberti wrote his book. Masaccio died in the 1420s. His career spans the 20s, and he died in the 20s. Still in his 20s when he died. But I think we go, sometimes we get carried away when we talk about the impact of Alberti. Perhaps here we should say that Alberti's book also reflects growing practice and new trends. Masaccio's Trinity fresco, for example, already seems to contain some great intermediary figures or commentators, like the Virgin Mary standing to the left of Christ, as you can see from this close-up. He's more or less looking at the viewer, turning as though she's just noticed you shuffle up to the fresco inside the church. So her body is still pointing towards the figure of Christ, but she's turned her head towards you and she gesticulates, inviting you, one assumes, to meditate upon the sacrifice of Christ and also the mystery of the Holy Trinity. The figure on the right is a figure that Alberti doesn't clearly single out, but I think this could be another type. This could be our exemplary figure. You could therefore consider the Virgin Mary is inviting you to pray like St. John the Apostle and meditate upon the sacrifice and the mystery. Okay, let's start looking after the 1430s for some more evidence of these types of figures in paintings. Botticelli's famous Uffizi Adoration of the Magi, which contains lots of not very well hidden portraits of the Medici family. If you haven't seen this painting, you just want to point out that the three kings all kneeling and about to kiss the feet of Christ are in fact three generations of the Medici family. So this is not sort of secret imagery in any way. This is a very politically charged painting. And if we look around the painting, there are, of course, Alberti, I think, would be very pleased with this painting. It's very much your busy composition. It's very much peopled with exciting figures and colours. And in fact, if we look on the left-hand side, there's a group of people who act as commentators, gesticulating into the middle of the painting, consider what's going on. These are, of course, contemporary 15th century Florentines, play acting, as though they were at the Adoration of the Magi. And on the right-hand side of the painting, that other detail shows a man in an orangey robe looking out at you with a rather unique expression on his face. Almost certainly a self-portrait of Botticelli himself, creating that bridge between not just the painting and the viewer, but between the artist and the viewer. So Botticelli takes it a level further. In fact, statistically speaking, I can bet you now that if you find figures in the Uffizi Gallery or other collections of 15th century painting in Italy where figures in the painting are actually looking out at you, half the time it's going to be the artist himself. This became a trademark way of indicating who the artist was. Halfway back, behind him, you can see there's another figure, just here, looking out at you too. Not the painter, it's actually the man who paid for the painting. A trademark way of treating the man who paid for the damn thing, as it were. This is a privilege bought by the patron, so that he too is permanently at the Adoration of the Magi, permanently paying his public political tribute to the regime of the day, which is the Medici family. Another, I think, clear example of an artist who's not only knowledgeable, familiar with Alberti, but following these Albertian precepts is Fra Angelico, who did so much work in the 1440s at the convent of San Marco. This is the San Marco altarpiece that once stood on the high altar of the church. Again, a Medici commission. Again, many of the figures in it are Medici family members, including, kneeling in the bottom left-hand corner, Cosimo de' Medici himself, the founder of the Medici dynasty, the manager of the Medici Bank, who paid for the painting. And there he is, imitating a saint, not even dressed as himself, but imitating Saint Cosmas, and that kind of punning reference to his own name, was a very familiar way of smuggling himself into these paintings. And there he is looking at you, inviting you to zoom into the Holy Family, but also clearly putting his stamp on the painting as his, rather than Fra Angelico's painting. We may have the rise of the self-portrait, but we also have the rise of the patron in these artists, in these paintings too. Okay, let's zoom right up to probably the most, for me, the next most influential figure in any discourse about gesture and pose in 15th century painting, Renaissance painting in Italy. And that's a British art historian called Michael Baxendale, who spent much of his later professional life in the USA. And a groundbreaking book. He had a sociological approach to art history, and his book, Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy, really set out some brand new ideas about how you can interpret gesture and pose in paintings. And what Baxendale declared was that there's such a thing as the period eye. Lots of text here. It will never substitute the wonderful book. So if you haven't come across Baxendale's book, it's well worth looking for. It's frequently printed for academic use, so it's very easy to find copies around. He argued something quite different that we haven't even considered yet. That we all process visual information in a different way. I think we'd all agree that straight away, because we're all different, our brains are different. But sometimes it's not just a combination of innate skills. There are skills based on your own personal experience, which are often culturally determined. So people within, if we share a culture, we share experiences, and therefore we share ways of perceiving images, and we can't get away from that. These common ideas also determine what visual qualities people find appealing, and therefore influence the output of artists. The artists, too, are engaged in this dialogue. And then this kind of crushing declaration on the right. The 15th century experience of painting, therefore, was not the painting we see now. As much as a marriage between the painting and the beholder's previous visualizing activity on the same matter. Anticipating his social and geographical and cultural surroundings, the painter, therefore, is painting in a certain way for certain results. And so Baxendale claims that happens so much that effectively the painting we see today is different than how it looked back in the 15th century, because we're so different. And we can't claw back that period eye. We can try and reconstruct it. And he suggested ways in which we can try and reconstruct it. Perhaps like students of language and linguistics, he conceded that we've probably lost a lot of understanding of visual experience. But he did point out some very interesting texts. For example, and again, we don't need to read all of this, but Baxendale pointed out an interesting category of people who were probably very well versed in gesture, that with whom we're not very familiar today, and with perhaps that we can rediscover through surviving text. He suggested that there were certain communities, like preachers or religious orders that followed vows of silence, that were very well versed in gesture, and gestures that could have been so well known at the time that they could well have influenced the way that people see images, or the way that people saw images at the time. For example, from one of many texts that Baxendale has discovered, Meditations on the Life of Christ, early 1300s, by an unknown writer who's been given this name. This is a writer whose prayer book directs readers to contemplate religious paintings and follow a certain prayer or thought process while they're looking at a painting. That is, using an image as a tool for prayer, or imagining images as well. So there's this long recommendation about how you should kneel, adore your Lord God, your mother, salute the Holy Mother of Jesus respectfully. I mean, after reading this, I think anybody's approach to a religious painting is inevitably going to change. Give you another example. There were prayer manuals, not just for religious orders that followed vows of silence, but also for Dominicans and Franciscans, orders which were very keen to distinguish themselves from other orders and to assert their independence in a very chaotic time. The 9 Ways of Prayer, for example, was published somewhere in Bologna at the end of the 13th century, and directed Dominican friars, specifically, to learn and adopt certain forms of body language and posture and hand gesture as well during prayer, but also for preaching as well. I've seen a couple of reproductions of preaching manuals as well, but let's have a look at this prayer manual first of all. It discusses the 9 ways of prayer, and as you can see, it goes through different physical positions and attitudes. Unfortunately for us, it was also illustrated, so we have all 9 here as well. Look at this. It's great. It's a complete prayer manual, not just about what you should be thinking or what you should be doing, but the physical attitudes and gestures one should adopt to strengthen, to intensify, to complete and execute these modes of prayer. So let's go back to that list again. We'll go through them one by one, actually. Now, if this lecture was truly interactive, I'd have you all up out of your chairs. But I won't. I shan't, unless you'd like me to. You can do this if you'd like to. But I'm going to begin with humbling oneself before the altar of God. So our little miniature St. Dominic is bent over in his room. And this is humbling. Humbling. Now, imagine, as we go through these, what I'm suggesting, and obviously based on Baxendall's great work, is that we're not familiar with these things now. But if you were familiar with these instructions and guidebooks, you would look at Renaissance painting in a different way. You would probably read it in a different way. You'd be expecting things differently. That's the idea. Second way, lying prostrate upon the ground. Third way, concentrating on the suffering world. This is where St. Dominic has out his whip and he's flagellating himself on the back there, still plenty of blood. In this scene, we have blood spurting from the crucifix of Christ on the right as well. Actually, it's the same in all of them. Fourth way, contemplating on the crucifix and genuflecting. So you see St. Dominic bilocating at times as well. He appears twice in each scene, adopting those changing attitudes and poses. Fifth way, standing before God, various attitudes of prayer. Here's an interesting gesture which is almost vanished altogether in Christian communities, except, as far as I know, Catholic communities as well. The hands upraised like this, showing the palms, which is an orant or prayer gesture. And this one is quite interesting. Sixth way, standing in the cruciform position, contemplating Christ's passion and death and praying the rosary. Adopting that position certainly would bring you into physical communion with an image of Christ on the cross in a different way. Seventh way, praying with the hands held up high in humble supplication. Spiritual reading, and let's get through these now. Meditation as preparation to contemplation. This is where the friar becomes practically a hermit and wanders off to a solitary life in the desert. Now, if you Google prayer handbooks, prayer gestures, it just goes on and on and on. I mean, there are manuals of prayer everywhere, very often adopted from medieval traditions. Dominicans or other friars actually get out into the world and do what they were training to do all of that time in isolation. And I'd love to imagine young novices practicing gestures in front of each other. I should imagine that must have happened. When you're preaching to the few, they can all hear you. And you probably don't need to gesticulate much, except to strengthen some of your points. When you're preaching to the many, I'm quite sure that gesture became key. And I think we can imagine preachers, particularly of the Dominican order. This is actually a scene of Saint Bernardino of Siena, who was a Franciscan, in front of the famous Palazzo Pubblico on the Campo in Siena. I think we can imagine those preachers moving from country to country, from language to language, using gesture as a way of overcoming the linguistic barrier they would have had talking to different audiences, and because of the sheer size of the spaces that he was trying to cover. I'm sure in some of the larger church squares of Tuscany, you wouldn't be heard right at the back of the square. Preachers, we know, also interacted with artworks as they gesticulated. They invited people in churches at times to look at altarpieces or frescoes or sculptures in the church and use them again as a guide or a basis to contemplation. Remember, they were preaching to a public that was largely illiterate as well, and used those artworks in churches, as is famously said, as Bibles for the illiterate. Okay, let's go back to Fra Angelico and have a look at a famous example of where this touches again, I think, 15th century art. The work of Fra Angelico, who frescoed dozens and dozens of cells in the Dominican convent of San Marco in Florence during the 1440s. In every fresco, in every cell, is different. They're quite unique. And still today, there are different theories and ideas about why this cell has this fresco, why this one pops up twice, why this one is repeated. But people have often looked at some of those texts we've looked at as a key. And in fact, when you start looking at these frescoes based on what we've looked at already, you start to see that the attitudes that the Dominicans adopt in these frescoes is significantly different each time. For example, in this image of the Annunciation in one of the cells, you find a Dominican martyr this time. It's probably St. Peter Martyr, because I can see some blood trickling down his head, just here. Right? Standing back, hands together in prayer. Each of the incumbents of these cells was probably invited to project himself into the scene by adopting the gesture and the position and the body language of the Dominican painted in the scene. This was a great way of transporting yourself into that scene as a means of meditation and prayer while you were in your cell. Let's go to another couple of cells nearby. Here we have St. Dominic adopting a position of prayer, lifting his hands up, palms up, as he's meditating upon the crucifixion. And then we have St. Dominic, and you can always tell it's St. Dominic because there's a star on the halo or hovering nearby. Meditating, reading a book. And what's he reading about? He's reading about the suffering of Christ, which is going on behind him. But it's not really. It's his thoughts. It's his meditation upon that act. Virgin Mary on the other side, leaning her chin on her hand. I think we have to take that either as melancholy or meditation as well. There's a whole row of cells in San Marco as well, where the topic is consistently crucifixion. And they're all slightly different. St. Dominic will be hands clasped. St. Dominic will be hugging the crucifix, blood almost running over his knuckles as he's clutching the wood at the base of the cross. These were probably very instructive frescoes intended for a specific audience, perhaps the novices. Okay, let's go further in time throughout the 15th century. A painting which, of course, is quite very famous for its range of gesture. And I think Alberti would have been delighted with this one as well, because again it shows us mastery of single-point linear perspective, creating unity of space and time. We have lots of figures. It's a busy scene, great range of colour, great range of physiques and faces and ages, and a tremendous range of physical gesture, body language, hands and gazes. Leonardo himself, even though he never managed to publish anything, did intend to write something similar to Alberti's work. So from the notebooks we find statements like this: "The figure is most praiseworthy, which by its actions best expresses the passions of the soul." Very much along Alberti's lines. And then a line which explains why in so many of Leonardo's drawings we find these dramatically contrasting faces, from the grotesque to the exquisitely beautiful, from the real to the ideal. He says, "Beauty with ugliness together are stronger. They make each other more intense." That's what he's saying there. And we have, fortunately, some preparatory drawings which must relate to what the workshop was doing to prepare for the Last Supper. And even with little captions around the heads of each of the apostles, where Leonardo was clearly playing around with the extremes of passion or emotion. They were preparatory drawings, and some of the ideas were dropped, some were substituted, but the final result is clearly a collection of contrasting ages, facial types, hand gestures, body language, and gazes too. An explosion of emotion, very rigorously organized into 4 groups of 3. So there's enormous uniformity, but within that, tremendous range. Particularly in that lower right-hand scene with St. Peter and John the Apostle. Look how close he's pushing them together because they're so different, as that drawing shows. But sometimes it's a bit more puzzling. Botticelli's Uffizi Annunciation. Archangel Gabriel is announcing to the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is in a very complicated pose, which is full of all sorts of different things. But those hands seem to be creating what I would instinctively interpret as a defense or flight. In fact, the bottom half of the body seems to be turning away. She's sort of running away. And if you close in on those hands, I think one of the most beautiful little details in all of Botticelli's paintings, where he's playing with the fluidity of lines set against the rigidity of that grey door frame. It's almost as though the angel is pushing the doorway open, opening up the Virgin Mary's room to the outside world, almost pushing the wall towards her. So, maybe she's defending herself. But then we look at this image, Leonardo da Vinci's Annunciation, where we have a very aristocratic, a very demure Virgin Mary. She's not running away. She's just almost as though she's interrupted from her book. She's just looking up and saying, what? Pardon? Look at that, how static and composed she is. But she's doing the same thing with that left hand. So what can it mean? Well, let's look somewhere else. How about Botticelli's Primavera? Venus is doing it as well in the middle of this picture. Now, Baxendale tackled these kinds of problematic gestures and came up with a suggestion. Because I should imagine Venus is not frightened here or running away. So what can it mean? Well, Baxendale suggested this is one of those gestures that we just don't really understand until we research it and find out what it means. Like somebody trying to learn vocabulary in a foreign language. He found that his theory was that gesture is a gesture of invitation or welcome. He cited a few sources, including this woodcut of an innkeeper from a book about the rules of chess from 15th century Florence. And then, if you backtrack into some of these paintings, maybe he's got that right. This is Venus inviting you into her bower, her grassy clearing. This is the Virgin Mary, perhaps startled, but also welcoming the salutation of the archangel. And so on and so forth. That gives you an example of how Baxendale's insistence on the period eye can lead you to look at some of these paintings in a very different way. Now, when one teaches, one tries to involve students as much as possible in what you're talking about. And when I'm teaching about gesture, bodily language, and pose and gaze, I think the only way to get the students interested in the topic is to actually have them involved physically as well as intellectually in the whole thing, because it is very physical. It's about people. It's figures of art. That's what we're studying. So I ask my students in my course, and this includes the LYME students right now this semester, to go away, to choose an Italian Renaissance painting and to reenact it, to restage it themselves, and using digital photography, study the original. Particularly if it's a freestanding sculpture, they need to take lots of images from different directions. As Leonardo once said, what did he say? A sculpture is... Michelangelo said, a sculpture is 1,000,000 paintings. I shouldn't say those kinds of things here. We're going to be arguing going amongst the students. But so I task my students with that, to study a Renaissance work of art from this perspective, gesture, body language, gaze, and then go out and do it. And then to write about what you learned from doing it. Not just how it felt, it was difficult, couldn't reach that, couldn't stretch my leg. What did you learn from it? Because everything you see in a painting is, of course, is a decision. It's a result of a thought process. So I've been doing this for several years, and I get students not just from LYME, but I get engineers, marketing majors, criminal justice, forensic science, you name it. We get a big range of our students, and it's great to see the ways that they approach this differently. Everybody has a different approach. Take this Last Supper, for example, and my students, they're so ingenious. This is a group of 3 engineering students, believe it or not. Now you're thinking, hang on a sec, there were 13 people last supper. Actually, I tell a lie, it's 4 engineering students. And what they did was, they did a bit of photoshopping, and they recreated the whole thing. It's the same 3 guys, once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Brilliantly done. So maybe this is the skill of the engineer, I don't know, who's great at the software or something. And the 4th member of the team was the chap who sits in for Christ right in the middle. Now that's very funny. That was great fun for them. It was even funnier for the people of Prato watching them do this, because they decided to do it in one of the piazzas of the city, outside a restaurant, so they borrowed the tables and set this out. So there was quite a crowd gathering as they were photographing this, which was good fun. But if we go back to the original, you can see they've actually done a pretty good job. It's difficult, and in an ideal world, you take this hundreds of times and keep going back to the drawing board and get it right. Done a pretty good job in identifying the fact that you need 3 people 4 times to create these little nuclei of intensity and questioning on themselves. They did a great job there. And of course, what we can't talk about, what you won't see, is what they then wrote about it, is their analysis, their discoveries, which are usually very good if they tackle the photographs in a very imaginative and ambitious way. Back to Leonardo da Vinci, you know, we get some of these scenes in very unlikely settings. There's a couple of girls who are in the residence hall in Prato, imitating Leonardo da Vinci's Annunciation. Now, you know, one of their papers actually was very good because she talked about their failure to really capture the scene, which was fantastic. Talked about the things that they should have done, the things that they couldn't do. So that was quite an interesting paper. Here we have a very unusual version of Masaccio's Trinity on a chair instead of a crucifix, standing inside the dorm as well. You know, some students go the full way and get sheets and blankets to imitate some of the 14th century costumes. Great papers. Here's another one which took us up into Caravaggio's work, a group of students working in one of our local restaurants. This is a good one because they decided to survey this with about 20 or 30 photographs actually, from lots of different angles. And as a group they wrote a great paper about sort of the spatial relationships between figures in a two-dimensional work like this. There's a very famous painting just outside Prato in a village called Carmignano, and it's Pontormo's Visitation, which I'm sure is familiar to many people here. Fortunately, many students go to see that and they tackle it. Here we have a group of students who decided to tackle the Visitation, tackling some of those very peculiar spatial relationships between the figures. Of course, with all of these paintings, in their written answers, they're focusing on some of the very unusual gestures or hand positions. Take, for example, the hand of the Virgin Mary on St. Elizabeth's shoulder. Just here. There we go, just here. Okay? Forming what is a very common hand configuration, particularly of 16th century Italian painting or Mannerist painting, which is the two central figures joined together, which for some reason became a token of elegance and beauty and bearing. I don't know if you did that naturally, well done if you did, but it's these two things together. I sometimes joke with students that, because it pops up on so many Medici portraits, that it's an M, but I don't, I'm just joking, it's not kind of a Medici gang sign, but I don't think it's but look at that, they spotted that, and they pulled that off on the corner as well, and they wrote about that. They wrote about that, said this is wholly unnatural, and so they found some other paintings which had found it, and they tried, you know, they proposed a few ideas about what it might mean. There's another one, a little less successful, another slightly high Renaissance Last Supper with a few figures as well. Must say it brings students together as well, these kinds of works. It's an interesting one as well. A couple of fire science students, of all people, imitating this image of the Mary Magdalene, even going for some interesting lighting as well. So they wrote about the way that the gestures are often picked out by different lighting situations as well. These two hands, quite clearly, tremendously elegant, tremendously refined. It's a very aristocratic vision of the Mary Magdalene, with a handmaid to her left. In fact, we're entering a period of art now, the High Renaissance Mannerist period, and Mannerism has sometimes been branded as the triumph of style over substance, where there's so much reference to the court or to the patrons of art that even the hand gestures are emulating the bearing and manners of the patrons, rather than some of the rather grittier, more brutal gesturization you see in 15th and early 16th century painting. Up on the rooftop terrace of the school as well, we had an interesting attempt at Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ. And then one of my favourites as well, this one here, which we used this on the ticket as well, the poster for this lecture. Students love this one. I've had so many decapitations handed in to me as well, which is quite fabulous. Now, these students want a wonderful paper about the lighting and the relationship between lighting and anatomy in Baroque painting, particularly in the work of Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi, writing a lot of great detailed work also about the hands, the musculature, a relationship between male and female anatomy as well. This was a very successful painting by 3 students a couple of years ago. At the end of the day, the students enjoy this process. They learn a lot about Renaissance gesture.
Is that a shaving cream beard?
Yes, it is. Well, yeah, it's sort of half and half. There's a bit of shaving cream and a bit of paper.
Really proud of yourself shaving.
Really?
Yeah, close shave. So, you know, our students are generally out there for 1 semester at a time. And I think there are certainly parallels to be made between their experience trying to learn languages, trying to learn the gestures of the locals who inhabit Italy, and for many of them trying to interpret the non-verbal language of Renaissance painting. Many of them are our students that don't look at Renaissance painting. It'd be their first history course. So it's a great gateway for them to interpret these things for the first time. I found that making them imitate these pictures obliges them to do that. I recommend you do this next time you visit a gallery or a museum. Although these days I've noticed curators telling people off who are posing in front of paintings. It's become quite a fashion. Many contemporary artists have also explored this as well. I'm thinking of Bill Viola, for example, who does a lot of recreations and video of Renaissance artworks as well. So there's a very serious productive side to this as well, as contemporary artists revisit Renaissance themes. So we see a lot of that. And Bill Viola, in fact, is having a great show at the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence this year at some point. So that'll be fun. I think he's going to present a lot of his video recreations of Renaissance artwork. So if you Google Bill Viola, you'll see a lot of his recreations of Renaissance artwork. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop right there, but I'm absolutely open to any questions or more questions you have.